On the last morning of 1942, convoy JW-51B carried 54,000 tons of supplies through the polar night toward Murmansk. 202 tanks, 2,000 vehicles, 100 aircraft. The arithmetic of Allied survival packed into 14 merchantmen, and hunting them through the Arctic darkness came a German force worth roughly 400 million Reichsmarks at 1939 exchange rates, the heavy cruiser Admiral Hipper and the pocket battleship Lützow, escorted by 6 destroyers, 8 guns capable of throwing 300-kilogram shells, armor belts up to 80 millimeters thick, combined displacement of 34,000 tons. Against them, Captain Robert Sherbrooke commanded 6 British destroyers: Onslow, Obedient, Obdurate, Orrery, Orwell, and Achates. Each cost the Admiralty roughly £500,000 to build. Each mounted 4 4.7-inch guns. Combined displacement 13,200 tons. The Germans possessed more than twice the weight and quadruple the firepower, but Sherbrooke understood a different kind of mathematics, the arithmetic of numerical advantage and coordinated aggression. The Admiral Hipper represented Germany's ambitions in steel and its limitations in industrial capacity. Laid down at Blohm and Voss in July 1935, she consumed approximately 85 million Reichsmarks during her 42-month construction, about £7 million at pre-war exchange rates, or roughly the cost of 14 British destroyers. For that investment and those months of scarce yard space, the Kriegsmarine received a ship displacing 18,200 tons at full load, capable of 32 knots on 132,000 shaft horsepower, armed with 8 8-inch guns in 4 turrets. Her designers had crammed in 12 4.1-inch dual-purpose guns, 12 torpedo tubes, 3 aircraft with a catapult, the complete package of a modern commerce raider meant to hunt down merchantmen and outrun anything powerful enough to catch her. But the package had costs beyond the Reichsmarks. Her high-pressure steam turbines were temperamental and unreliable, breaking down repeatedly during operations. Her range was limited to 6,500 nautical miles, far less than intended. Her armor protection, though adequate at 80 millimeters on the belt, consumed weight that could have gone to machinery or fuel. She was magnificent in harbor and troublesome at sea. The problem wasn't the engineering. It was that Germany could barely afford to build her at all. The entire Hipper class, 5 ships ordered, only 3 completed for combat, represented a construction program that consumed years of yard capacity and thousands of tons of scarce armor plate. Admiral Hipper alone took from July 1935 to April 1939 to complete. Blücher, her sister, sank in Oslo Fjord in April 1940 after Norwegian coastal guns and torpedoes found her before she'd even completed her shakedown. Prince Eugen survived the war but spent more time in dockyards being repaired than at sea hunting. The last 2 ships were never finished. Seydlitz sat at 95% completion when work stopped in 1942, and Lützow was sold incomplete to the Soviet Union for 150 million Reichsmarks, a price that barely recovered construction costs while giving Stalin detailed plans of German heavy cruiser design. Britain's 6 destroyers told a profoundly different story about industrial philosophy and strategic priorities. The O-class and P-class destroyers were designed in 1939 as utility vessels, deliberately intermediate between the large fleet destroyers, like the Tribals, which cost £800,000 each, and the smaller Hunt-class escorts. The Admiralty had done the mathematics. Britain needed destroyers in quantity for convoy work, and perfect was the enemy of adequate. Sherbrooke's flotilla represented about £3 million in total investment, roughly half what Admiral Hipper had cost Germany, and crucially, they'd been completed in 18 months each at 6 different yards scattered across the country. John Brown built Onslow at Clydebank, White built Obedient at Cowes, Denny built Obdurate at Dumbarton, Fairfield built Orrery on the Clyde. The construction was deliberately distributed across Britain's shipbuilding infrastructure, ensuring no single Luftwaffe bombing raid could cripple destroyer production. It was industrial strategy as much as naval design. Each destroyer displaced 2,200 tons fully loaded, roughly 1/8 the size of Admiral Hipper. Each mounted 4 single 4.7-inch guns in open mounts, capable of firing a 50-pound shell every 5 seconds in trained hands. The guns were individually laid and trained. No fancy power systems, no complicated fire control computers. Simple, reliable, and above all, adequate for engaging destroyers and submarines. They carried 8 21-inch torpedoes in 2 quadruple mounts, and these were the real threat to heavy ships. A single torpedo hit could cripple a cruiser's speed or flood machinery spaces. The threat alone was enough to force heavy ships to maintain distance, and most importantly, these destroyers could be built in quantity across Britain's dispersed shipbuilding capacity. By December 1942, Britain had launched over 200 destroyers since September 1939. Germany, despite possessing sophisticated yards at Hamburg and Kiel, had completed fewer than 40. The production differential revealed the strategic reality. Britain could afford a war of attrition. Germany couldn't. The strategic calculus was ruthless. If Sherbrooke lost all 6 destroyers protecting this convoy, the Admiralty could replace them in 6 months. Admiral Hipper represented 3 years of German shipyard capacity and couldn't be replaced at all, not while Bismarck was still being mourned and Tirpitz sat paralyzed in Norwegian fjords. Hipper was too valuable to risk in a stand-up fight with torpedo-armed destroyers, even weak ones. But Admiral Oskar Kummitz, commanding the German raiding force from Hipper's bridge, had direct orders from Hitler himself. Avoid unnecessary risks. Don't engage heavy forces. Above all, don't lose the ships. These were the rules of engagement for a navy that couldn't afford losses. The German plan was geometrically sound. Kummitz split his force into 2 groups. Admiral Hipper, with 3 destroyers, would approach from the north, engage the escort, draw them away from the merchant ships. Lützow, with 3 more destroyers, would wait to the south, positioned to fall upon the undefended convoy once Sherbrooke's destroyers were committed to fighting Hipper. It was a pincer designed to exploit numerical superiority and firepower advantage. The problem was, the plan assumed the British would behave rationally, that 6 destroyers would not charge directly at a heavy cruiser. Sherbrooke saw Hipper's destroyers at 0830 hours on December the 31st, emerging from the snow squalls. At first, they were mistaken for Russian escorts until they opened fire. Sherbrooke's response was immediate and deliberate. He turned toward the threat. Not a way to screen the convoy, not to position for torpedo attacks, directly toward Admiral Hipper. Onslow and Orwell raced ahead through the polar twilight, guns firing, signal flags demanding the German identification. It was calculated aggression designed to exploit the one weakness in Kummitz's orders, his fear of losing the ships. The geometry of the engagement revealed itself in minutes. Admiral Hipper could fire her 8-inch guns every 15 seconds. Each salvo weighed 2,400 pounds of steel and explosive, but her fire control directors could only track 1 target at a time effectively. Sherbrooke's 6 destroyers came at her from different bearings, weaving through snow squalls, appearing and disappearing in the darkness. Hipper's gunners had to choose: engage the nearest threat or maintain fire on a single target. Either choice meant some destroyers would close to torpedo range. The mathematics of gunnery had shifted from weight of broadside to number of targets. At 0930, Hipper scored her first hit on Onslow. An 8-inch shell struck the bridge, shrapnel shredding through the superstructure. Captain Sherbrooke was hit in the face, his cheekbone shattered, nose broken, left eye destroyed. He remained on the bridge for another 40 minutes, giving orders through the pain, maintaining the attack. His tactical insight was simple. Hipper could sink any one of his destroyers in minutes, but doing so would allow the others to launch torpedoes. The threat was enough to keep her at range. At 10:10, with Onslow crippled and burning, Sherbrooke finally handed command to his executive officer and collapsed. He'd later receive the Victoria Cross. The citation would note he'd saved the convoy by attacking a force that outweighed his flotilla 3-1. 30 miles to the southeast, Rear Admiral Robert Burnett commanded Force R, the light cruisers Sheffield and Jamaica, positioned to provide distant cover for the convoy. These ships represented another calculation in Britain's arithmetic of adequate quantity. Sheffield, a Southampton-class town cruiser, had cost roughly £2.2 million to build at Vickers Armstrong on the Tyne, commissioned in August 1937. Jamaica, a Fiji-class colony cruiser built by Vickers Armstrong at Barrow in Furrow, cost perhaps £2.5 million and commissioned in June 1942. Together, they cost less than Admiral Hipper, and Britain had built 10 town-class cruisers and 11 colony-class cruisers by 1942. They weren't designed to fight heavy cruisers in stand-up gunnery duels. Sheffield displaced 11,350 tons fully loaded compared to Hipper's 18,200, and their armour was correspondingly lighter. Their 12 6-inch guns in 4 triple turrets fired a 112-pound shell every 5 seconds at ranges up to 25,000 yards. Hipper's 8 8-inch guns threw 300-pound shells that could penetrate heavier armour at longer range. In any sustained engagement, the German cruisers' heavier shells and better armour protection would eventually tell. But Force R wasn't designed for sustained engagement. They were designed to be adequate for convoy defence, fast enough at 32 knots to reach the fighting, well armed enough to threaten German commerce raiders, and expendable enough that the Admiralty could risk them in action. If Sheffield and Jamaica were sunk protecting this convoy, Britain had Belfast and Edinburgh and 8 more towns already in commission. Germany had Hipper, Prince Eugen damaged and under repair, and that was the entire list of operational heavy cruisers. Force R had been shadowing the convoy at a distance, their Type 271 radar tracking through the Arctic darkness and snow squalls. When Sherbrooke's distress signals came through at 9:30, reporting engagement with heavy German units, Burnett immediately turned south at 30 knots, racing toward the sound of guns. Kummetz never saw them coming. At 11:30, Sheffield and Jamaica emerged from a snow squall at 8,000 yards, point-blank range in naval terms. Their first salvos hit Hipper before her crew realized they were under attack. 3 6-inch shells penetrated the cruiser's boiler room, flooding it, reducing her speed to 28 knots. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. Kummetz had been hunting a convoy protected by destroyers. Now he faced cruisers, possibly more than 2, possibly a battleship following behind in the darkness. His orders were clear: avoid engagement with superior forces. He turned away. The German destroyer Friedrich Eckolt, attempting to rejoin Hipper in the confusion, mistook Sheffield for a friendly cruiser. She closed to 2,000 yards before realizing her error. Sheffield's guns fired at point-blank range. Eckolt disintegrated, taking all 321 crew to the bottom. The engagement lasted less than 2 minutes. The cost differential was stark. One German destroyer worth perhaps 12 million Reichsmarks and irreplaceable, sunk by salvos from a cruiser Britain could afford to lose. To the south, Lützow had achieved perfect tactical position. The pocket battleship was 8,000 yards from the convoy's merchant ships, her 6 11-inch guns able to destroy any freighter with a single salvo. But Lützow's captain, Rudolf Stanger, was on his first operational mission. He'd seen smoke from Akates, assumed heavy forces were nearby, and held his fire. The seconds became minutes, the minutes became an hour. The convoy sailed past, untouched, while Lützow's crew waited for orders that never came. At 12:30, Sheffield and Jamaica spotted Lützow and opened fire. Stange, following Kummetz's earlier decision, immediately turned away. The Germans withdrew to the northwest, shadowed by Force R, until they disappeared into the Arctic night. The accounting was brutal. The British lost the destroyer Akates and the minesweeper Bramble, about 250 men and perhaps £600,000 worth of ships. The Germans lost Friedrich Eckholt, 321 men and 12 million Reichsmarks. But the real costs were strategic. All 14 merchant ships of JW-51B reached Murmansk intact. 54,000 tons of supplies, tanks, aircraft, ammunition reached the Soviet Union. The Arctic convoys continued. Admiral Hipper returned to Germany for repairs and never became fully operational again. The Kriegsmarine surface fleet had demonstrated it couldn't protect its own raiders or accomplish its mission, even when presented with near-perfect conditions. The battle reached Hitler's desk within hours. The Führer had been waiting for news of a great victory. Multiple merchant ships sunk, a convoy destroyed, validation of his expensive surface fleet. Instead, he received reports of retreat, of a convoy escaping intact, of German capital ships fleeing from British light cruisers. His rage was apoplectic. In a meeting with Admiral Raeder, he declared the entire surface fleet would be scrapped. The heavy ships were useless cowards. Their steel would be better used as U-boats. Raeder resigned in protest. His replacement, Karl Dönitz, managed to preserve the surface fleet, but only by agreeing it would play a defensive role, tying down British resources rather than hunting convoys. The Battle of the Barents Sea effectively ended the Kriegsmarine surface war in the Arctic. The arithmetic explained everything. Germany had built 3 Admiral Hipper-class heavy cruisers at enormous cost in time, money, and scarce materials. Britain had built 10 Town-class light cruisers for roughly the same total investment. Germany's ships were individually superior, heavier armor, bigger guns, longer range. Britain's ships were adequate, but adequacy in numbers defeats perfection in scarcity when the perfect weapons are too valuable to risk. Sherbrooke's destroyers worked because Britain could afford to lose them. Force R's cruisers worked because there were 6 more towns back in British waters. The German surface fleet failed because every ship was precious, irreplaceable, and therefore paralyzed by the fear of loss. The lessons were already being written into British doctrine. The Admiralty's post-battle analysis noted that 6 destroyers properly handled could neutralize a heavy cruiser through aggressive tactics and threat of torpedo attack. Numbers mattered more than individual capability when the numbers could be sustained. The O-class and P-class destroyers, designed as cheap utility vessels, had proven more strategically valuable than the Tribal-class fleet destroyers that cost £800,000 each. You could build 3 utility destroyers for the cost of 2 fleet destroyers, and the math suggested the 3 would be more effective in convoy defense. It was the same calculation that had produced the Flower-class corvettes, cheap, simple, adequate ships built in quantity. The strategic vindication came in the shipyard figures. In 1943, British yards launched 87 destroyers and escorts. German yards managed 31. Britain could absorb losses that would cripple Germany. A destroyer sunk protecting an Arctic convoy was a tragedy for its crew, but a rounding error in the Admiralty's production spreadsheets. Admiral Hipper, damaged in the Barents Sea, was a strategic disaster that tied up yard space for months and ultimately resulted in her being laid up as a training ship. The economic exchange rate was overwhelmingly in Britain's favour. Force R shadowed the German retreat until losing contact around 1500 hours. Sheffield and Jamaica then shepherded JW-51B into the Kola Inlet, arriving on January 3, 1943. Not a single merchant ship had been lost. The crews learned later that the battle had produced a bureaucratic earthquake in Berlin. Raeder's resignation, Dönitz's appointment, Hitler's order to scrap the fleet. They couldn't have known their aggressive tactics, and Burnett's timely arrival had fundamentally altered German naval strategy. But they understood the essential truth that had won the engagement. A convoy defended by adequate ships in quantity was safer than a convoy defended by perfect ships in scarcity. Captain Sherbrooke recovered from his wounds but lost his left eye permanently. He returned to duty, eventually retiring as a rear admiral. His tactical decisions on December 31st became required study at the Royal Naval College, not because they were brilliant, but because they were correct. 6 destroyers couldn't defeat a heavy cruiser in a gunnery duel, but 6 destroyers could threaten, harass, and ultimately neutralize a heavy cruiser that was too valuable to risk. The threat of loss was more powerful than the reality of combat when the enemy couldn't afford to lose. The Battle of the Barents Sea was decided before the first shot was fired. It was decided in the shipyards of Clydebank and Cowes and Dumbarton, where British workers laid down destroyers at a rate Germany couldn't match. It was decided in the Admiralty's budget, which could afford to lose escorts faster than Germany could sink them. It was decided in Hitler's own orders, which demanded his precious heavy ships avoid risk. The engagement itself was merely the arithmetic playing out: 6 cheap destroyers and 2 adequate cruisers, proving that numbers, properly employed, defeat individual excellence when that excellence is constrained by scarcity. Sherbrooke had attacked because he understood the exchange rate. Kamitz had retreated because Hitler had made clear the exchange rate was unacceptable. In the end, Britain won the Battle of the Barents Sea in the balance sheets, and Germany lost it in the bureaucracy that valued preservation over action. The convoy reached Murmansk, the supplies reached the Soviet Union, and the German surface fleet, unable to accomplish its mission without risk, became strategically irrelevant. A fleet in being that could be ignored because its own commanders feared to use it.